things that I was interested in. I was interested in like crime and racial inequality, social inequality. I was interested in conflict. And so I did a lot of my research on like conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. And what was very fascinating is that every time, I'm researching on, these really critical issues that we as sociologists try to explore and kind of deconstruct and try to understand. I find like there's a central kind of pattern where gentrification is taking place, right? And it comes up almost everywhere, right? Where I was doing my research, right? So if I'm looking at racial inequality when it comes to, housing, right? When it comes to, police stops, right? Or the criminalization of certain minority communities here in the United States, it's almost always associated, right? Or tied to this process of gentrification. So I'm looking in one direction, right? Trying to understand, like I said, police, why are, police more likely to stop people of a certain race as opposed to another race? And then when you kind of deconstruct that question, you find behind that question, there's all these things that are happening. And one of those major things that are happening is gentrification, right? And so, I found it quite interesting because it's not only here in the United States. So a lot of what I do, Tyler, is I study, conflicts in Africa, in Middle East. And again, right, I'm looking at these conflicts and looking at how those who have power, right, treat those who don't have power. And you're seeing this sort of displacement happening, right, of those who don't have power. And, people call it different things, but in reality, it's just another form of gentrification. So what I'm taking a step back, right, and I'm looking at everything that I'm doing, and I'm finding that gentrification is happening everywhere, right? Everywhere. And so that's what got me interested, right, in gentrification in general. And so, why, and by the way, not a lot of people think gentrification is like colonization, but what is colonization, right? It's when one group of people, right, go into another people's land and do what? Take their land, take their resources, control their economy, control their political systems, right? And in many ways, not only displace the people physically, but also culturally, socially, economically, right? And so we know that this has happened for, the past couple of hundred of years, right? What the Europeans have done in Africa, in the Middle East, and South America, here in America to the indigenous populations. And so it's fascinating when I'm reading that history and then, looking what's happening in Philadelphia, and you're like, wow, there's some parallels here, right? People are being displaced, right? People are being displaced. People are being removed from their neighborhoods. Their culture is being occupied and controlled by those in power, right? So for me, that was a clear-cut, tie right there in terms of the same process, right? So when I saw that, one of the questions was like, and when Dr. Edwards sent me that email, I was like, yeah, that's at least my perspective, right? That gentrification, this form of displacement, is really no different than colonization, right? Where one group of people do what? Displace another and control their economic resources, control their political realities, control their culture, right? And so that's what got me, really interested in this question. I can go on and tell you all these different areas that I went into later.
All right, I just made up this question just now when you're talking about it, but when you said they're all like just different names for the same thing, like would imperialism fall into that category, you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Think about what and I'll tell you, I'm a byproduct. It's just kind of crazy, right? My dad's from Morocco, from North Africa, right? And the French colonized North Africa. And when they went to North Africa, this is exactly what they did. They went to all the major cities, kicked half of the residents out of the nice areas of those cities, forced them into the poorer areas, right? Controlled their economics systems, controlled politics. They couldn't really get involved, or didn't have the ability to get involved in politics, and would only provide a little avenues, right, for those, people who are the majority but are minority when it comes to power, to, to work or to make money or to have any upward social mobility. So my dad, the reason why he came to the United States in the 1950s was because the French and the Spanish, they would take basically street children and send them to Europe to work to help rebuild Europe after World War II. Imagine that sense of like chauvinism, right? Like I can just take some random kid from North Africa and send him without his parents to Europe to work. And so that's what they did with my dad to help rebuild. At that time was France after World War II. And long story short, they put him in the circus, and then he came here to the United States in the 1950s. But that imperialism, right, which is this kind of, it's this political kind of system where some nations, right, think that they have this right over the land, right over the property, right over the culture, right over the resources, right, of the rest of the world, right, of Africa, of the Middle East. And so absolutely, to me, imperialism, colonization are like the same side of the different sides of the same coin, right? And so gentrification is, I'm sorry, I'm talking.
Oh no, you're fine. This is good. This is good.
Cool. But so to me, gentrification is a byproduct of that, right? It's, how do you displace people? Well, you do it through doing what? Creating laws, right? That forcibly push people out of where? Their neighborhoods, push people out of where? Their cities. Push people out of their jobs, push people out of, the places that they identify with, that they link their whole identities and familial ties with, right? And so gentrification to me is just one of the many processes that the Europeans did in Africa and the Middle East. And what unfortunately our own government here in the United States allows rich folks to do to Black and brown people.
Yeah. Say it again.
Yeah, sounds good. So to me, it's very similar processes. It's just the way we see gentrification today, Tyler, is because everything is legal, right?
Yeah.
Everything that, when you look at, what's happening in Harlem or in Philly or even, now little by little in Wilmington, when somebody or a developer goes and buys
Sorry,
you're good. When a developer goes and buys like 6 houses from, poor Black and brown people, because they couldn't pay their taxes or their property taxes, or they, couldn't afford the cost of living, or they were senior citizens, right, who couldn't just, sustain themselves in that neighborhood. Oftentimes the process of where this property transitions from one group of people to the developer or to some rich, let's just say it out, some rich white folks, right, is done in a very legal way. So nobody really pays attention to it, right? Yeah. Oh, it's legal, it's all legal. But we also know that what is legal is not always moral, right? Yeah. And that's important to keep in mind. And so that's why I think it just slides under the radar, right?
Yeah. I know a lot of times also like sort of like, even though it's obviously bad for the people that don't have the power, like you said, but a lot of times like I follow like a lot of like real estate what's it called, Instagram profiles or whatever, because I like the houses and interior design and all that. But I'm watching it and it's like you're kind of like trying to like glorify it, make it seem like it's all right and stuff. I mean, the house is nice, but like they're also like someone doesn't have a home now possibly because of that house and renovation and all the stuff they did.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Tyler, because it almost sanitizes it. And that point that you just bring up is no different than what the British said when they were in India. Oh, we're bringing the railroads. We're giving them civilization. We're giving the Indians democracy. We're giving them a good government. We're helping them build their economy, while at the same time they're doing what? Just taking. And that's the same way, right? When you watch these, like, what's that? The home TV channel, I forgot what it's
Oh,
called.
HGTV, yeah.
HGTV, yeah, I was stuck on Property Brothers for a little while there. I was, yeah, property,
Yeah.
yeah, thinking I was gonna, like, fix my own home sometime, but never happened. But when you watch those shows and you see somebody, renovating, and you're like, what's wrong with renovating a neighborhood or a home in a neighborhood? But what that does is it displaces, right, the community without looking at those structural questions, right? I'll just bring this up, like in a city like Boston, right? When the median kind of average wealth of an African-American family is $8 compared to a white family at 200 and something $1,000. And when this was printed in the Boston Globe, most people thought that it was a typo. They're like, there's no way, right, that the African American, and we know Boston has a long history of racism, but there's no way that African Americans in the city of Boston, right, are their median wealth, their average wealth is about $8 compared to 250,000 the white families. And so that disparity is there, right?
Yeah.
And so it just facilitates that dispossession, right? Because there's those structural issues that need to be addressed. And it's the same disparity with colonization. If I'm coming in with all the weapons, all the resources, all these things, it's easy to displace West Africans, Moroccans, where I'm from, or wherever, countries I'm thinking about.
Yeah. I was just reading, not a while ago, I was reading an article, I think, and it was in Africa, some place in Africa, I'm pretty sure, probably everywhere over Africa. But they were saying how most of the resources that Africa has are usually they would profit off, only the white men are profiting off of it, and they're not even making profit off their own products and resources.
Absolutely. And so that gets us to, I think, that really important question of neo-colonialism or new colonialism, right? So this is a really important concept, Tyler. So colonization, when you think about traditional colonialism, it's when, the British went into Ghana and they brought their weapons and they brought their army there and they settled in Ghana, controlled their system, etc. Now, neo-colonialism, right? You can control Ghana and their economy without having the British military there or the American military there. How do you do that? You control their economy. You control, the goods that they produce in that country. You control who they can trade with. And so you still benefit economically. You still, like you said, in the Congo, like a country like the Congo, which, if I'm looking at my cell phone here, this cell phone that we all, are privileged to have, and we don't even think twice about it. Most of the minerals that are in here, right, are come from Africa. But, if those countries are actually being paid exactly what those minerals are worth, right, then the Congo will be one of the richest countries in the world, right? Yeah. And so it's easy for the Americans and the Chinese and the Europeans just to kind of take, and without necessarily even having one military, regiment there. That's neo-colonialism. You create laws, right, that allow you to exploit without necessarily being physically at a place. And that's why gentrification, right, you have these laws that allow developers and allow, rich folks to do what? To go into a place like Harlem in the 1980s and 90s and, buy up properties from, Black families who are suffering economically, right? And, renovating them and selling them, to, other rich white folks and changing the landscape of, a place like Harlem, right? Yeah. It's done through the law, but so it seems like it's normal, it's okay, but it's not. And this is why we need to be conscious of it and criticize and be critical of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And then, what was it? Oh, I had another question because you were talking about how they were displacing people and that couldn't afford to live there anymore. So this was a follow-up question for that part.
Yeah.
So instead of gentrifying communities and displacing people, what can be done instead to keep Black families and low-income families in their homes without displacing them and increasing the cost of living while still improving their living conditions?
Yeah, so
That was a little loaded.
Yeah, no, but it's a good question. That's a good question because to tell you the truth, right, we know that, you know, gentrification is this process of displacement, and it's a process where those who have power, right, are taking advantage of those who don't have power. And oftentimes, at least in the US context, it's usually what? It's usually very much a racial issue, right? Those who don't have power usually what, right? Black and brown people, and those who have power usually white, right? And so there's two levels here. I think one, we have to address the structural issues, right? There has to be new laws, policies that protect senior citizens, that protect, low-income neighborhoods, that, support Black and minority-owned businesses, right? In their communities that they're in. But I would also say there's a second level, right? And this is more the radical side of me, right? I would say, and this is kind of me, like the Malcolm speaking through me, right? The Black community needs to organize. There has to be a reinvestment within the community, right? The Black community, supporting Black institutions like we're, Delaware State University. I think, if you look at the power of the African-American community in the global system, right? If you collect the wealth of the African-American community and you compare it to other nations, it's probably one of the most powerful. The African-American community, if you look at the wealth of the African-American community, again, in comparison to the global system, it's one of the most powerful communities in the world, right? Not in the United States, but in comparison to others. But what is needed is organization and reinvestment and resistance to this is the radical Anwar speaking, that dominant, white kind of, I don't want to say just a culture, but the dominant kind of culture that is reinforcing white supremacy in almost every aspect of the lives of African Americans, whether it's in housing or policing or the economy and on and on and on. And I think there has to be a kind of a mobilization, right, that occurs where there is reinvestment in the community, that the community organizes against, right, what's happening. And I think of a place like Harlem as a perfect example, right, where you see gentrification happening, because this is not only a displacement of, people, a community from their homes, right, but it's also, imagine, when you think about Harlem, you think about the Harlem Renaissance, and you think about the history of the Great Black Migration, and you think about this really critical, important city where intellectuals and art and all these things emerge, right? Within the emerging Black culture, that and all these kind of developments that happened in the early 20th century, right? That now, with gentrification, not only did rich white developers, not only are they controlling the housing and the properties in the old churches and the bars there, right? But they're also controlling the culture. And to me, that's crazy, because as an outsider, right, if I'm going to Harlem and I want to see Harlem, right, and I'm associating it historically with, say I don't know anything about Harlem, but I just read a tourist guide, right, and I read a tourist guide about Harlem, and say I'm coming from China or I'm coming from Oklahoma, right, and I want to go to Harlem, who's going to be controlling how that culture is being, how the Black culture is being represented in Harlem? It's going to be basically non-African Americans, right? We're going to be displaying, right, what Black culture is. And so in many ways, it's also, gentrification is a form of appropriation. Because what are they doing? They're not only buying that land, right, but they're also buying that culture, reshaping it and then reselling it basically to the masses, right? And now what happens is the community, right, where the culture emerged from no longer controls that culture.
Yeah.
And to me, that's another kind of level of tragedy there, right? And so when I come in as an outsider, right, it's kind of, there's a cool concept you should look up. It's called hyperreality. It's called hyperreality. So, it's like when you, Imagine when you look at all these different ads on, when you look at all these ads like portraying, these different images of women on billboards, right? We know they're all photoshopped, right? And all these images of men and women on billboards are all photoshopped. But when you engage with these images enough, you begin to think that's, our ideal of how beauty should be like, right? Because we're constantly engaging with these images.
Yeah.
So it's not based on reality, it's based on what? Hyper reality. Well, it's the same thing. These folks who are now controlling not only the physical properties, but also the culture that Harlem represents is not controlled by the Black community anymore, but by who? By white folks. And that's it's even another level, right? That I think it just makes it even more tragic, right? And that's what colonization does. It not only displaces, but it begins to dominate and have an authoritative kind of, role over the people that are being dominated by whatever country or whatever group of people that has power. Yeah.
I never thought of it like that. I never looked at that aspect of it all. I just was like focusing on like the part that people being displaced and like they couldn't afford it anymore and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, and to me that is just another tragic level, right? Because not only are you physically being displaced, but your culture, your history is now being controlled by who? By those people who are buying the developers who don't care about your culture or your history.
Yeah.
They care about what? Profiting from it, right? And so to me, that's what, really, especially in places like Harlem, it makes me really upset. And so I wrote a paper, Tyler, and stop me anytime because I like talking about this stuff, but I wrote a paper.
If you have the link, can you put it in the like chat or email my mom, because then I could probably use that for research as well.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I'll just send you I'll send it to your mom, and then I'll send you the actual paper. And what I did is, so what's happening in Morocco, we have a city, and what we did a study in the city called Tangiers, which is in northern Morocco. And what the European immigrants that come to Morocco's a poor country. They go and buy up these cheap houses in the middle of town that are these old, like 400 or 500-year-old houses that represent like the history and traditions of Morocco, right? And so what do? They go buy those properties, and then they renovate them, right? In that process of renovation, the property prices go up. It kicks out the traditional folks who are very, very poor. They can no longer afford to live there. But also the center of town is where, if you're a tourist, this is where you come to see Moroccan culture, because that's the oldest place. That's the oldest part of town, right? So you're thinking you're going to go see Moroccan culture, but in reality, what are you going to go see? Some European, exactly. European guy's renovation of what he thinks Moroccan culture is like. And that's the same thing that's happening in Harlem, right? And so if I was a tourist, you think it's real, but it's not real, right? It's just that guy's image of what he thinks Harlem is like, or Morocco, or whatever it may be. And so that's the other layer that I think, the cultural layer, right, that I think is also something that we should be conscious of and push back on, right? Because it's not just a physical displacement, it's also a cultural displacement.
Yeah. Speaking of people, what was I saying? Speaking of Harlem, I also know in DC, my dad was from DC. So it was originally called, you probably know this, but it was called the Chocolate City.
Yeah.
And now when we go there, like, I'm trying to figure out when I first started seeing it. But I know, like, when we go there now, it's not so chocolate as it was when I was little. Like, even when I was little, probably like 10 or 12, it was already starting to change. It looked different. But yeah, it's like a lot of young white people. And it also makes me wonder, like, how, Jesus, there's a bug in here. It also makes me wonder how, like, they're affording these condos, because in DC, in a place that's like a city, I'm sure it's expensive in Harlem as well as New York. So it's probably even more expensive. I know in DC, in the city, is like rent, and like to pay for that is really expensive. And so that also makes me think about the topic of like generational wealth, because even though they probably do have a good job, they probably also have that previous wealth from their mom and dad, which is also why Black people can't stay in their own homes, and Black and brown people can't stay in their own homes. Like, they can't fix it up like the way that the white people do.
Exactly. And I'll also send you that article on Boston, because when you look at those asset wealth, right? That wealth, when you look at the average African-American family has $8, right, in wealth, comparison to a white family at $250,000. It's hard to renovate and to raise your property price. It's hard to compete. It's hard to compete. And then you have all these laws that get passed silently. No, they're not like out there in the open. There's no like police for like with, pushing you out, but you're pushed out little by little. And that's what they do. Right. And that's why I think it's easy for us to just kind of ignore it until, like you said, your father goes back to DC and he's like, if he was here in Delaware for the while, like, what's going on here, right? It's like, my community no longer, looks like me, right? They no longer represent, this is not the community that I grew up in, right? But also it pushes, it changes the culture. Right now you see you're going to see, so when all these new communities come in, what do? They're not going to build shops and stores that reflect the interests of those of the people that were there. They're going to build what? New coffee shops,
cafes.
Yeah, exactly, right. Coffee shop for hippies and whatever, and hipsters, whatever they call them, and to serve this new population. And so you feel alienated even in your own land, even in your own neighborhood. That's colonization, right? You're in your own country and you can't even speak. I mean, one of the things that the French did in Africa, and one of the things that the British did in Africa and also in the Middle East, is they forbid the local languages. So you can't even speak your own language. I'm in my own country and I can't even speak my own language. You see what I'm saying? And it's the same thing. I'm in my own neighborhood and I can no longer go to my, the mom and pop shops that I grew up with, right? And that I was a part of, or the churches that I was a part of. So it changes everything about, right, it's more than just that physical, right? It's also the cultural. And I think that's what changes everything. And to me, that's the epitome of colonization.
Oh, we're on question 2. Well, I was asking questions as we went, and then I don't really need the other questions, so I think we're good. I would just forget I was gonna say now. Thanks, Mom. I'm gonna get my coffee. Oh man, no, I remember. So I know in Wilmington, you were also talking about that. There was a guy that came to our school. I forget his name. I wish I remember. I could probably look him up. But he has like this company, and they're basically trying to rebuild the homes, but also put like the Black and brown low income families back into the homes. And he's also trying to make like recreational centers for like children and all that, so they can like get out that area, but also making it better so they won't really have to leave at the same time. Exactly. It also made me wonder, because I know I go to Sanford, it's a private school and all that, but there's this guy, this old white man, his name's Humphrey, something like that. Anyways, so when the Black guy had told us that he was like helping him with all that, it also made me wonder, like, is this really genuine? Like, is this really going to help the Black people? Because I know the white man might actually be genuine. Humphrey might be genuine in trying to help, but also feel like he's just profiting from it as well and all that. I don't know. Yeah,
no, that's a good question. And I think, it's one of these things that's why, your generation is really, really critical in all this, right? Being conscious of this, being aware of these issues, right? That are impacting Black communities, not, from Wilmington to New York to LA to San Francisco, Oakland, right? And being aware and knowing how, we can kind of, construct the right kind of mobilization tactics to be able to, organize, right, Black intelligentsia, right, the intellectuals, the businessmen, the businesses, the communities, right, to kind of reframe how we look at our own communities and how we reinvest in our own communities. And that's why, because I don't think, based on my reading and my understanding of different contexts where gentrification has occurred, if the community themselves don't resist, right, and don't find alternative ways to reinvest back into their own communities and have aid, right, from local government and from other communities, it's very, 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 very hard, right? And, because at the end of the day, it's about power. And unfortunately, these developers come in with multi-million dollars, checks and all this money, and they're ready just to spend, and our politicians, how our politicians work. And so it's really going to take a grassroots movement for folks to be conscious about these issues, right? In Wilmington, we're working on a project with DENREC, which is like the environmental agency here in Delaware. We're working with underserved communities. And so we were, basically in Southbridge here in Wilmington, and you're beginning to see, right? You have this older senior Black population, right, that has been there for 40, 50, 60 years, and are literally being little by little pushed out of these neighborhoods, right? And if the community doesn't come together, right, to force the local government to pass laws on zoning, to pass laws that support the Black senior citizens and paying their property taxes and all these different other structural issues, we're going to see gentrification occur again and again and again. And if we don't, as Black and brown people, don't rise up and don't organize and really know the issues, because it's more than just physical displacement. It's also cultural displacement, Tyler. And to me, that gets at, like, that hurts, right? When you know that I'm going to go to Harlem and this white person has authority on how my culture is represented, or if it's as if I was African American, right? Just thinking about that, and I'm not African American, it kills me. It really does. It hurts, right? Because that's a different level of displacement, right? Because now they have that authoritative role of representing the culture, right, to the masses, right? And that history to the masses, and so that the resistance to gentrification has to come from within also, right? The community has to organize those resources and get politically active and change those laws, but also work within the community and kind of that Malcolm X kind of frame, right? Reinvest from within, and I think that is key. I really do, and some folks might not agree with me, but I really believe it has to be two ways, right? You focus on the structure, right? Politics, economics, Democratic Party, Republican Party, try to mobilize folks to change policies and all this stuff, but also there has to be that grassroots level mobilization saying enough is enough, right? And we have to look after our own, right? And we have to mobilize and organize and say no more, right? And so.
When you're saying how when people go back to their hometowns, like I said, my dad goes back. When we all go back to DC as a family, like see our other family in like Maryland and DC, like we don't see people that look like us. And like my dad and mom are like trying to, like, I guess, buy a home back where they're from. Like they really can't, because the prices are so high and insane. So they really can't.
It happened to me too. So like so I was born and raised here in the United States. And so my brothers and I were like, hey, we're going to buy a home in Morocco just to have that connection. And you would think we're in North Africa. You're like, oh, we can afford something. I swear to God, the property prices are like no different than here. And mostly white Europeans who come once a year to enjoy the beaches and to enjoy the cheap food and all this stuff. They bought all the great properties, and I'm not even talking like nice. I'm just like nice, good old condos and homes. And you feel displaced. You're like, I can't even go back to my own, city and buy something that I can afford. And I think that that's a problem, right? And so. And I'll tell you something real fast. I'll let you I think in Morocco there has been resistance, and the local community has resisted, and so they've organized and they put pressure on the government to put pressure to limit how many homes Europeans can buy and all these things, and that's helped a lot with property prices. But that's what I mean by grassroots level mobilization, thinking about the community first. We need to think about our own first and mobilize that sort. So and it worked in Morocco. So
hopefully we can start doing that here.
Absolutely, Tyler.
I don't have any more questions, but as we're talking, I just think it's so ironic, like, because you mentioned World War II, I think you mentioned, yeah. So it's so ironic how after they did all like the redlining, and now they're like trying to like take it back. Like after you put us there, now you're trying to like put us nowhere at this point. Like you're not even trying to like have us anywhere to be.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
No, it makes total sense. It's ironic and it's messed up at its core, right? You have these policies that try to push African Americans out of the real estate market, force them in properties in areas of cities like South Side of Chicago is a perfect example, where there's no investment, little educational investment in educational institutions, economic institutions, talk about food deserts and all these things. And then, and now, because there's the University of Chicago, for example, is in the South Side of Chicago, there's all this interest in the South Side of Chicago now, right? And at the same, and there's this other displacement that's happening little by little, but it's happening. And it's just this kind of ironic story. And that's why, I think Black and brown people have to be empowered, and they have to organize and be conscious of these issues. And and I think it's awesome that you're in high school and you're thinking about these issues and talking about these issues, because that's where it starts. That's where it starts, right? At your age, right? Because by the time my age, you'll be, just you'll be on the ground changing things and changing the world, right? As your mom said. And that's what we need. Right. And I think being aware and if people are aware, right, I don't like, it's hard to just sit still and just kind of like take it, right? And you're like, no, we have to do something, and we have the power to do something. We have to do something.
I feel like the problem is people don't want to be uncomfortable, so they don't want to be aware about that stuff, like you said.
Yeah, because it pushes you away from your comfort zone or the next paycheck, and that's hard, and that's very, very hard. But there's things that we can do, and I think just there's Gandhi said, quoting Gandhi, but Gandhi said, even if we can't change things with our hands, at least knowing it in our heart and feeling having that empathy, right, and being conscious of what's happening is something. It's important, right? And I know sometimes I read things that's going on in the world and Africa or whatever, my home country, and I can't do anything. I just it kills me inside. I can't. But I think it's cliche to quote Gandhi, but as he said, it's important though to at least empathize and know what's going on and be conscious of what's going on. And in whatever capacity that we have, we can do what we can. And I think that's important.
All right.